welcome back to another episode of Adventist A. I'm your host, Kevin. Today I'm joined by Dr. Melodie Roschman, all the way out from Waterloo, Ontario. She has her PhD studies through the University of Colorado Boulder, which involves research and looking into gender, pop culture, and right-wing and evangelical Christianity, all very interconnected and very hot topic conversation. So thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Kevin.
I'm looking forward to seeing and hearing where your research has taken you. And as tradition on my podcast, I'm curious about what led you to here. What brought you to do a doctorate degree? What's about these topics that fascinates and fuels you?
That's a really big question, so forgive me if I go on for a bit. So I actually wrote my dissertation about memoir, and I included in that dissertation a chapter of my own memoir. So I feel like I can plug and say, if you want a longer version of this, it's in print in Spectrum magazine, and also on ProQuest and wherever dissertations are found. But basically, I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I was born in Nova Scotia, but I spent most of my childhood in Ontario. My dad is a Adventist pastor. He still is. And my mom's an Adventist elementary school teacher. I am an eldest daughter, which you cannot tell from the overachieving. And I grew up in London, Ontario, and then Caledonia, Ontario, which is right outside of Hamilton. While my dad pastored for most of my childhood at one church, Heritage Green Seventh-day Adventist Church, which was a church that started when he took over as mostly a church filled with senior citizens. It was next to a nursing home. And by the time he was transferred, when I was 18, it was a church with a lot more young families and things like that. And yeah, I went to Adventist schools all the way until university. I went to Kingsway College in Oshawa, much like my mother, and I went to Andrews University for undergrad, much like both of my parents. And through all of that, I was really, really fixated on being a good pastor's kid. There's kind of a joke, I think, in Adventism, but also in Christianity more broadly, that pastors' kids basically come in two flavors. Like either you are aces at Bible Swords Up and you're very devout and you are a goody two shoes, or else you like run away from home and you get a bunch of tattoos and you marry a man named like Snake, right? And I was very determined that I was going to be the good kind, but I really bristled at this kind of goody two shoes stereotype because it was really important to me from the time that I was very young that my beliefs were internally consistent and that I really understood what I believed. I think my first word, like most kids, was probably like da da da, but I like to believe it was why. Certainly my first full sentence was why. And to my parents' credit, they were people who really encouraged that kind of exploration and that depth. Anytime I showed an interest in anything, that would end up under the Christmas tree. So I got microscopes and I got chemistry sets and books about history and watercolor pencils and all these different things. And I also felt like I could ask my dad all these different questions that I had about archaeology and about theology and suffering and all these things. So I went to Andrews. I was in the honors program at Andrews, which I love dearly. I wrote a piece for Spectrum last year about the history of the honors program and its impact on me. And I had really, really wonderful mentors in the honors program who taught me to, kind of look at sources, to do my own research, to write. They called out all the laziness in my writing, which made me cry, but also made me a better writer. And it was in that honors program, roughly 2 weeks actually into my time at Andrews, that I realized that graduate school was something I could do. I grew up, like I think a lot of people do, with this idea that grad school or that being a professor was only for like geniuses, like Albert Einstein kind of thing. But my professors in the English program and the honors program said to me pretty soon, they were like, if you like doing this, you can keep doing this. Like if you want to spend your days reading and thinking and having conversations, there's no reason you should have to stop when you finish. So I had a wonderful time at Andrews. And the director of the honors program, Dr. Monique Pittman, who's one of the finest scholars in the Adventist Church, worked with me the summer before my senior year on a weekly basis to help mentor me to get me ready to go and do my master's degree. And she helped me with my applications. She was there to cheer for me when I got in. And ultimately, much to my chagrin at first, but my gratitude in hindsight, despite applying to programs in the United States and Canada and Britain, one of my claims to fame is that I did get into Oxford University, but I did not go because it would have cost me like $80,000 with no scholarships. So I did not go, is that I got a full ride at McMaster University in Hamilton, 20 minutes away from my parents' house. And so despite my dreams of going off to England or BC or Washington or something like that, I moved back home and I did my master's. And we can talk about my master's more in a bit, because something that I find very funny about my master's is they sent us an email a week before the program started, because it was an accelerated one-year master's program. And they told us we needed to pick what our master's thesis was going to be about. And I was like, I haven't even started grad school yet. Like, my parents were also moving houses that week. So I came home from Andrews after a summer of working there. And I had a week to like help my parents move into a brand new house and then also start my master's program. All my books were in boxes. And I get this email saying like, what are you going to write your master's thesis about? And as we will probably discuss in a bit later, one of the interesting flaws of my education is that I have not read much Canadian literature, and most of my education, higher ed, was in the States. So I picked the only adult Canadian author I could think of, which was Margaret Atwood. I had read Anne of Green Gables and The Handmaid's Tale, and that was basically it. And of course, The Handmaid's Tale is about the United States. And so I wrote my master's thesis partially on a Canadian novel called Saltfish Girl by Larissa Lai, which my advisor suggested later, but also about The Handmaid's Tale, which is by a Canadian author, but is set in Gilead in the United States and is all about the relationship between gender and right-wing American Christianity and storytelling and memory. And I kind of thought that I would keep following those kind of threads for my PhD. I knew I wanted to do a PhD, but I took a year off in between my master's and my PhD. And when I was getting ready for my PhD, you have to write all these documents, like your personal statement and your writing sample and all this stuff. And I had thought originally when I was in my undergrad that I wanted to write about Virginia Woolf, because my undergrad thesis was about Virginia Woolf. I really loved Virginia Woolf. I still love Virginia Woolf. I think she writes stream of consciousness about memory and stuff in really beautiful ways. But in my free time, I was always reading memoirs of these women interrogating their faith. Because I was dealing with my own frustrations, long-standing frustrations. A real big kind of turning point for me was the summer after graduation in 2015 during the General Conference session when they voted again not to ordain women. Something that I've only kind of recently realized is that if I had been a boy, I probably would have been pushed towards being a pastor from very young, because I love to read and I love to write and I am not afraid of public speaking and I love chatting with strangers and I'm good at languages, all these things, but like not once in my entire childhood did someone ever say I should be a pastor, despite the fact that I was literally class pastor at Kingsway in grade 12. Meanwhile, I have a little brother who now is an archaeologist, but when he was a kid, all he had to do was stand within like 10 feet of my dad wearing a suit and tie, and people would be like, he should be a pastor just like his father all the time. So like I was deconstructing all of these different things. I was asking all these questions. I remember one day during my master's, I was bored with the discussion and I just got out my laptop and I made this list of like all of the questions I had about Adventism and faith. And I sent it to like every single person I could think of in the church who like I respected, like my professors, friends, mentors, all those things. And I was just like really stuck on this idea of like what it would mean to be a Christian and to be queer and to affirm refugees and to affirm women and believe in feminism and all these things, and like how people made that possible. Because I often saw people frame kind of the relationship between faith and non-faith, or between Adventism and everything else, is a kind of all or nothing situation where Adventists have the truth, and if you don't like the way that the truth is interpreted by the General Conference, by Ted Wilson, by conservative theologians, then you are not a good Adventist and you have rejected the truth, and it is time for you to go. And so I basically decided I was going to do my PhD on the memoirs of women, ex-evangelical women, who had figured out what it looks like to live a life of faith without compromising, without compromising on their beliefs about equality and justice and inclusion and, reason. And that's why I studied what I studied. I couldn't have known, when I started thinking about those applications, that Donald Trump would become president for the first time in 2017, and that my work would end up being really, really relevant to the ways that power circulates in modern American politics, and the ways that so much of the public conversation around meaning and gender and stuff has evolved. Sometimes I wish that I was like a medievalist, because, their work is not constantly being rewritten in the headlines, for the most part. One of my friends studies like Beowulf. Beowulf has been basically the same since Beowulf was written, with a couple notable exceptions in interpretation. But no, I had the good or bad luck to study something which is being discussed every day on the front pages of newspapers. So yeah, that is kind of a very long answer to your question. But as you can kind of hear, there isn't really a way to extricate who I am and how I grew up from what I study, because my dissertation was, a scholarly work about women and American Christianity and stuff, but it was also very much my attempt to answer all those questions that I asked those mentors of mine when I was sitting in that classroom in my master's degree.
And I think that's what's so awesome about continual education, is you get to apply your life and to seek the answers in this new researched way. Like I've had similar experiences with my master's degrees, as seeking the answers to the Adventist questions. And yeah, that encouragement to use your dissertations as kind of a self-reflective approach, it's really awesome. And I love how you framed it, because that's kind of the classical thing I wanted to get into, is you're a Canadian who knows nothing about Canada.
Well, I wouldn't say nothing, but certainly less.
Less, because that's kind of the interesting thing. As much as this podcast is kind of exploring and differentiating Canada as, not just another union or division of the church, but a whole country, we also want to acknowledge that even though being Canadian means not being American, we are always flooded, and the reality is whatever happens in the States floods into Canada, right? So conversations on Trump, even though he's not, the president of Canada, it's still relevant. Like there's a space there that you were expressing of, well, I wrote about Margaret Atwood, whose book is about the States, like, right? Like that's kind of the classical reality, is Canadians talking about Americans and that kind of thing. So I wanted to ask a bit more about that, how you see that transference in your work. Like, you noted that it seems like it's a daily thing that you're integrating and talking about your work. It's not said and done like Beowulf and some of these classics, which to me I think that's a positive, because it keeps you on your toes. So what have you noticed about that transference, especially as you had that insight into being an Adventist family with a mom a teacher, your dad a pastor, and I also echo that my dad was a teacher. And so me being a teacher, people are like, oh, apple didn't fall far from the tree. And it's like, well, no, it fell, and it's its own thing. I'm doing my thing. But what has it been like, or what have you seen or researched in that, like a conversation in the States? How does it flood into Canada, or get transferred into Canada?
Right, that's a fantastic question. Like any relationship, it can't, like any answer I give you will be simplified and so forth. Canada is such an odd mixture of influences from American culture, British culture, French culture, also, of course, like our own Indigenous people here in Canada. and our own kind of quirkiness that we've developed, in the last 170, I guess, years of officially being our own country. But yeah, I think there's a saying I know that I mentioned to you before we started recording that when the United States sneezes, Canada catches a cold, which feels particularly relevant because you currently have a cold and I have a cold that I got last week in Colorado, in the States, while flying home from my friend's anniversary party. So it's completely undeniable that kind of being the upstairs neighbor of the United States means whatever happens there influences us to the point where we have legislation in Canada to protect against this. Like, I know that we have certain laws around, like, our radio stations have to play a certain percentage of Canadian content because
50%, yeah.
otherwise, yeah, because otherwise American cultural influence is just so dominant, right? Like, it's like fighting against a current. And borders are made up, right? Like, I have so much more in common with people from Michigan than people from Michigan have with people from Arizona in many ways. My husband is from Wisconsin. Both of us grew up on the Great Lakes. He grew up on Lake Michigan. I grew up on Lake Ontario. Uh, People in Michigan say pop, like we say pop here in Ontario. Weirdly enough, I now say soda because I lived in Colorado for 5 years and I got tired of getting funny looks when I asked for things. So I just assimilated, which is what you do, right? So yeah, I think there's a couple things here. So first of all, Adventists love to think of ourselves as like a separate people, and to a certain extent that is true. I think that growing up, before I identified as Canadian or whatever, I identified as Adventist. And so when I made that kind of transition from being a student at Kingsway in Ontario to being a student at Andrews in Michigan, it wasn't really a rough transition. In fact, it felt kind of like a homecoming for me. I had cousins who went to Andrews. My parents went to Andrews. I had visited Andrews many times. It was like returning to the Mecca of Adventism, right? Like, here were these brilliant Adventist scholars. I joined the honors program instead of being the weird, nerdy kid in my class. It was everyone's classes, weird, nerdy kids all together in one classroom. Like, it was glorious. I loved it. But I also definitely did notice that cultural transition. One thing that I remember really startled me, this actually I realized years earlier, is my family and I were on vacation somewhere on the East Coast. I don't remember where now. I was like 9 or 10. And as sometimes happened on vacation, my parents would look in the phone book and find an Adventist church, and we would go there as visitors for the week. And we show up at this Adventist church, and I noticed that we are the only non-Black family in the entire church. And, like, there's all kinds of different churches full of immigrants and stuff in Canada. There's a lot of Caribbean immigrants, specifically in the area where I grew up. But I still was like, oh, this is like an oddly homogenous group of people compared to the churches I grew up in, which were often very, very multiracial. And I'm reading through the bulletin because I have never been someone who didn't want to read like every scrap of writing in front of me. And I see that we're in the regional conference of something. And I whisper to my mom, what's the regional conference? And then she, in the middle of like children's story or something, has to give me this like 30-second lesson on the incredibly complex racial history of the American Adventist Church, and the fact that like we had segregated hospitals in the American Adventist Church, and like a woman died because she wasn't allowed into this whites only hospital, and so a separate regional conference was created, and now there are still separate regional conferences that are historically Black in different parts of the United States, and how this is a really controversial topic. And she's like explaining all of this, and I'm just like, my jaw is dropped open, because obviously in Canada, well, Canada is also, built on white colonialism. We do not have an explicitly separate like governing structure for the Black church. And I ended up, weirdly enough, on a panel about regional conferences in university with Dwight Nelson on my one side and Tim Nixon on my right side, both these giants in the regional conference and the Lake Union conference, talking about this. And, I had to, it's a very complicated issue. And we're at a point now where, on the one hand, it's, to outsiders, it kind of seems like we have segregation in the American church. But also, if we just like dissolved regional conferences, you're going to look at a position where a lot of Black Adventists are going to lose positions of power and influence. Or if we dissolve both of them, it's a mess, right? It's one of those things where we have this deeply flawed past, and where the history of American racism is not something that the church has ever escaped. Adventists love to tell stories about like Ellen White was anti-slavery without recognizing the ways that like the same structures that shaped American Christianity as a whole distinctly also shaped Adventism. So that's like a way I've seen for my whole life that I was kind of shielded from that American history in some ways of Adventism. But that doesn't mean I wasn't shaped by it, right? Like we were all still using the same materials created by the General Conference and the North American Division. Our pastors were still educated at the seminary. Like systemic racism, Adventists love to talk about how multiracial we are without acknowledging the ways that like colonialism and white supremacy still shapes our theology and our history. And that is true in so many aspects of our lives, from conversations around drums being pagan things from Africa or whatever, to a refusal to respect cultural norms from other cultures, whether that's, tattooing or jewelry or anything like that. So those are definitely ways that I see that kind of influence. I also just think that because even though it is very much a global religion now, Seventh-day Adventism is a uniquely American religion. Like you can't understand Adventism without understanding the context of the Second Great Awakening and like American Methodism and that like very specific moment in American history and the church's relationship to like abolitionism and the temperance movement. We only stopped ordaining women because we wanted the fundamentalists of the 1920s, like American evangelical kind of, well, it wasn't evangelicalism then, it was fundamentalism, but like we only stopped ordaining women because we wanted to be accepted by fundamentalists, because they were trying to say that Adventism was a cult. And one of the reasons they said Adventism was a cult was because we were founded by a female prophet. Like Kevin Burden has written and been published on Spectrum about the fact that like the Adventist church became more and more American fundamentalist in the 1920s because it wanted this acceptance from American Christianity. So like, yeah, the Canadian church is different and it has its own cultures and things like that, and we can get into that. But like Adventism is an American religion, and you cannot separate Adventism from American history and American founding values.
And that's exactly how I felt growing up, without all the details, obviously, as a middle school kid. But I remember in middle school and in high school feeling that I wasn't as a full-fledged Adventist because I wasn't American. And the sort, like you said, the source materials, the sources of identity, the conversations, and that's kind of also one of the questions I've had searching through this podcast is, do we not realize, whether it's a North American division or whomever, that those things don't land in Canada sometimes? Like the conversation around same-sex marriage. That's not a conversation in Canada because we passed the laws, what, 2003 or something? 2005, and it happened. Like, oh yeah, that's a great idea, and then we moved on. Yeah,
maybe it is 2003. It's early 2000s,
right? Yeah. And like that's not like no Canadian is gonna. That's not being changed. Or abortion, like both sides of our government, or three sides of our government, have all stated they would never change that. And so it's like, where does this flooding kind of interfere with Canadian conversations and Adventism in Canada? Seems to go unchecked. Or even they're handing out the Great Controversy book, and I mean, questioning the method, sure, but just the title page has the Vatican, the U.S. Senate building, and an American flag, and they're handing that out in Canada. I'm like, do you not see that that's, as soon as a Canadian sees that, the majority are going to throw it out because it's American? And so this referencing to the States is uniquely Canadian, but yet it seems like it lands in weird and odd places. Like we love to make fun of the fact that we have better beer than the States. We always get bugged that the Stanley Cup hasn't been in Canada for a long time, and like so there's fun things there. Canadian football is on a bigger field.
Now, Kevin, you and I both know that as good Adventists, we should not know or care whether beer is better in Canada or the States.
Well,
For the
based on the
record, the
commercials,
best beer is in Colorado.
based on the commercials is what I know. And there's a good country song about it too. And so that room of exploring, like you've mentioned too, like it fits into a Canadian way, kind of ironically, because we know so much about the States. We are flooded by the States. Like you said, we have laws that 50% of our radio music has to be Canadian. I've had to teach my students that they don't have amendment rights because they're in Canada and we don't have a legal right to carry arms. And so it's in this confusion. I was wondering a little bit more about how you've seen it play out. Like you've noted some of your personal story as well. So how do what would be a way to search through this? Like what would be a tool or something to be like, okay, is this American? Is this Canadian? How could we begin to navigate this tidal flooding back and forth?
That's a really interesting question. I think that one of the fundamental kind of questions behind that question, though, is the definition of what it means to be a Seventh-day Adventist. Because much like the question of what means to be a Canadian, often we point to these kind of cultural markers for Canadianness or Adventistness, right? And I think behind this question, so like I'm really interested in the ways that we construct concepts of group identity. This is something I study a lot, whether that's group identity within a religious faith or within a sports team or within a fandom, right? I'm a huge fan of Lord of the Rings. I have a full half sleeve of Lord of the Rings tattoos, so oops on the pastor's kid thing. But
Now you're just the cool pastor's kid.
I know, right? I was always the cool pastor's kid. I was not always the cool pastor's kid. But like whenever I see someone or I talk to someone, often because of these tattoos, who also loves Lord of the Rings, I feel this instant affinity with them because we love the same thing. And I think that when asking the question of what it looks like to be a Canadian Adventist or be an Adventist who is not an American Adventist, we can't really answer that question unless we can pin down a definition. And we are very bad at agreeing on definitions as any group, not just Adventists. People are really bad at shared definitions, right? Of both what it means to be a Canadian and also what it means to be an Adventist. If the question is like, what brand of tortilla chips did I use in my haystacks, right? That's a very different question than how deeply am I invested in the prophetic role of the United States in end times prophecy? Or is a question of like, what role do I see the relationship between government and institutional church power playing in like society? I remember as a kid, someone told me hilariously that in Canada, unlike in the United States, there was no separation between church and state, which is true in a weird way because thanks to the Battle of the Plains of Abraham in the 1760s, like Catholic school is just free in Ontario because of like a treaty between the British and French governments 250 years ago. Like that's weird, right? But in other ways, like Canadian culture is very quiet about religion. It's very polite about religion compared to American Christianity. I mean, and that's, to be fair, is kind of something that was retconned in the United States. There's this fantastic book that I cannot stop talking about called Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Cobes de May, which is all about kind of the development from the 1920s onward of this like muscular right-wing American masculine Christianity. But one of the things she talks about is the ways in which during the Cold War, American identity as Christian identity was kind of constructed to oppose secular godless communism, right? So like "In God We Trust" is not added to the money until like Dwight Eisenhower is the president.
Oh,
Like,
I didn't know that.
yeah,
Oh,
"One
interesting.
Nation Under God" only becomes the pledge during Eisenhower. Like all of these things that we think about as like Americans are very publicly Christian are kind of added during the 1940s and 50s as this posturing on the national stage as being anti-godless communist. And obviously, the Cold War affects Canada just as much as any other country in the West. But Canadian identity is not, because we are not the main character, right? Canada doesn't have this need to like publicly define ourselves as Christian. And so historically, and I think Ellen White like recognized this, Adventism has defined itself in opposition to that kind of right-wing nationalist American Christianity. One of the things that I remember receiving in our house growing up was Liberty magazine, or Religious Liberty magazine, which was all about Adventists' pursuit of religious liberty. And I felt this odd affinity with groups like Jews and Muslims and stuff like that because of the Adventist Church's work to preserve religious liberty. And that's something that was true in Canada and in the States. But more recently, and I'm using recently loosely here as a scholar because as I mentioned, like Kevin Burden argues, in the 1920s, we really started kind of allying ourselves further and further with like fundamentalists and then later with evangelicals, because we wanted to be accepted as like mainstream Christians and not as a fringe group. We've seen this kind of embrace of right-wing or like nationalist Christianity, and that's definitely historically more true in the United States than Canada. But again, when the United States sneezes, we catch a cold. I was shocked when I got to Andrews and I met people at Andrews who were in the military, because Canadian culture as a whole just does not like revolve around the military the way American culture does. That's a big difference. I don't think I knew anyone other than like World War II veterans at the nursing home at my church, who had been like in the army. And then there were debates on campus among like fellow students about whether or not you could be in the military and who you could vote for. And to me, these debates were totally alien to the definition of historical Adventism. Like I read all the books about Ellen White and the other founders, and I loved Desmond Doss and all those things like that. And one of the defining characteristics of Adventism for me growing up, indeed, one of the things I still admire the most about Adventism is its historical status as a peace church, which actually is a tradition that I think is represented quite strongly in Canada. Out west and also here in Ontario, we have large Mennonite populations, which is another historical peace church. Here in Waterloo, we're around 5 minutes from St. Jacob's, which is a Mennonite village. There's a whole Mennonite farmers market, and people ride in horses and buggies on the road and stuff like that. So it is really interesting to see the ways in which Adventism and my Adventism was no doubt shaped by that kind of historical peace church lens, because it appealed to my Canadian sensibilities. Whereas I saw classmates in the States kind of more aligned with that larger right-wing American kind of allegiance between military and nation and Christianity. Sorry, you asked me one question, and I will like write you an article.
Well, it's fine because it's fascinating to see the different layers of it. Like I hadn't known about in God We Trust and some of these forms of using Christianity as anti Russian
Communism. Yeah.
communism, Soviet propaganda, which is quite interesting. Because I was also thinking about the shift in identity. Like one of the realities of Canada is we didn't fight the British. They kind of gave us our freedom as a country, and we didn't get the fullness of our government ability until 1960s when we can amend our own constitution. So very delayed in that way. And I know up until World War II, we were very British oriented, right? Like we but it's even odd in that, like during World War II, Canada declared war on Germany 4 days after the British, just to prove the point.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we were still, and then that transition during that war, we became American reliant, right? We put American technology up north to stop the Soviets. We bought American planes, and so Canada has remained, because there's another really good book, Telling Truth About Canada, and the author says we've always remained this colonial mindset that something, the better of something is outside Canada, right? We export everything. We have the raw resources, but we don't have any manufacturing plants. Our mining and forestry companies are all foreign owned. Tim Hortons is no longer Canadian; it's owned by a Brazilian
Yeah.
company. And I remember reading that book and realizing, like, yeah, we always think we're so humble to a default that we always think it's something better outside. That's why we're so good at saying sorry. Like the other day, I ran into, like, me and random person ran into each other. We both turned around and said sorry at the same time. And I was like, oh my goodness. And so it's interesting that the American, dynamic power, which they have in their military, which they have through the Revolutionary War, it creates a certain sense, like you said, like I don't know anyone in the military. I have a few friends in the police force. And so that would be an interesting difference. In Canada, our chaplaincy program does not go to military, and we don't have private hospitals. So that's one result. Like there's not really chaplaincy in Canada, other than schools and some universities. And so the history that plays into it, which is why I was finding it kind of interesting how you mentioned it's like, yeah, what is your defining characteristics of a community, and can we even agree on that? And I think that's such a key question: is what does it mean to be Adventist? And I think that's what I really enjoy about Spectrum is we get to talk about that. So with that kind of step, how would you define Adventism, or what would you use to even talk about what does it mean to be Adventist? Big question, I know,
That's a question.
but how would
So
we
the real
begin the conversation? Maybe like it's more than haystacks. So what are some markers we can trade back and forth of what it means to be Adventist?
So Ted Wilson would say that in order to be an Adventist, you need to affirm all 28 fundamental beliefs. And you should probably also be a member in good standing of a local Adventist congregation. And also, you probably shouldn't disagree with what Ted Wilson says. Which is funny because, again, I tend to look at the historical thing and uh, congregationalism, which is like a congregation up structure instead of a top down structure, is historical to Adventism. But a reliance on hierarchies, a fundamental creed in the middle, and having to do what the president tells you are not historical markers of Adventism. But definitely those are kind of the things I think, like on an institutional level, that would make you an Adventist today. Um, I would say, like I said, I think that the simple way, the way I explain Adventism to people when I have to like drop backstory really fast and be like, so here's why I didn't go to prom or have a prom. Here's why I've been a vegetarian since I was born is Seventh day Adventism, right? Like those are the two things that distinguish Adventists from Protestants, which is that they worship on Saturday instead of Sunday, that they believe in the still imminent return of Jesus in the second coming. And like other than that, Protestants. And there's a couple of things: the state of the dead, pacifism, health message, union of body and soul instead of Platonic dualism, stuff like that. But I think it was I can't remember who wrote this, but they were saying there is no Adventism, there is only Adventisms. Because if you ever go on the subreddit for ex-Adventist and you read the churches that people left, they feel like completely different experiences, right? And also to make things worse, like so backing up about Kristen Cobas de May, I promised I can't shut up about her. She makes this argument that like evangelicals are actually not united anymore by theology. Like evangelicals, technically speaking, believe in a personal relationship with Jesus. They believe in like sola scriptura and sola fide, which is only through the Bible, only through faith. They believe that they have to share their faith. They believe in, Jesus' death and resurrection, all these things. But like she argues that evangelicals can mostly be understood today politically and culturally. Like they are people who are more likely to vote Republican. They are people who are very anti-abortion. They tend to be more homophobic than average. They tend to be people who like listen to Adventures in Odyssey and read stuff from Focus on the Family, and they read certain Bible studies and watch movies like Fireproof and all this stuff like that. And similarly, not all Adventists know what Adventists believe, and not all Adventists believe the 28 fundamental beliefs. I know a lot of people who still are like active members of local Adventist congregations who definitely believe that gay people should be fully accepted in the church. I know people who don't believe in creation. I know people who don't believe Ellen White was inspired. I know a lot of people who at this point are mostly in the church because they have found a spiritual home there and they found community, and because they are comforted by so many of the rituals of Adventism. I don't think you can separate Adventism from its subculture. Like, I don't know if someone is an Adventist in that sense, if like they believe all those things, but they've never had fried chick. Like, I still eat fried chick. I love fried chick. It is like a top 5 fake meat, and I am a
I
connoisseur of fake meat.
I'm all about stripples. That's
Stripples
my
are so
thing.
good.
That I have a case in my freezer right now.
See, you want to talk about American exceptionalism? You can buy Morningstar products at the regular grocery store in the United States. It is not fair.
No, it's not. Like we always have to transport it up from Walla Walla when I go visit my aunt, and it's like, oh my goodness. But I
You can buy
love,
fried chicken on Amazon in the States.
but I love
You
how,
shouldn't though, because of Bezos. Anyway.
yeah. But I say I love how you're developing and kind of bringing out the reality that um, there's a culturalness there. Like we can set aside theology for a second and just focus on culture, or a good conversation is that interaction of theology and culture. And perhaps Adventism is so big, we need a better flexibility in there, right? Because if you go, we love saying we're the fifth biggest Protestant denomination. Like we love the big status. We love, like you said, we are the most diverse church. But when you break it down, you have a black church here, a Filipino church there, and so I wonder if we need a clearer pathway or network system. Like, the Catholics have how many orders? They're all Catholic, but you have this order, that order. And not to say we should be the Catholic Church, because that'll get me culture canceled pretty quickly. But I've been wondering, as you've been sharing, of, yeah, what does it mean to have grace and flexibility? Is there a way we could normalize flexibility instead of, it seems like it's a begrudging acceptance, like, oh, I guess you're Adventist even though you use drums. I guess you're Adventist even though you drink coffee. Like, I wonder if there's a way we can keep the bigness of it all, but find grace, or find a way to be like, you're an Adventist of this order, and I'm an Adventist of that order, like, order of Saint Mark over here, order of Saint Andrews over here. I don't know, but I think that's kind of the creativity I've been wondering about, as you've shared quite brilliantly some history in your story, is how do we apply flexibility and grace internally?
That that is the point where I feel like it's relevant to mention I'm not an Adventist anymore. Because for years, I really wanted to believe that that kind of heterodoxy, that flexibility, that grace was possible in Adventism because I had seen its possibilities. Like I said, I loved my time at Andrews University. I had so many wonderful classmates and professors who modeled for me the ways that people could disagree and be in relationship with each other. And I've certainly seen that modeled like in individual Adventist churches and in institutions. But at the end of the day, I think the fundamental question here is whether Adventism is defined from the bottom up or the top down. And the argument that has been made by the administrators, the people who we pay tithe to and give offerings to, the people who hire and fire pastors, who move them around on the world section, if not, in the North American division or the Canadian Union, which are generally more progressive only because their constituents are a little bit more progressive, is that the church wants to be like the Catholic Church. They want to decide what dogma is. They want to have a central leader. They want to tell people who they are and aren't. Probably one of the most notorious examples of this is a few years ago in California, when one of the California conferences, I think it was, decided that they were going to elect a female pastor as their conference president. And the General Conference yearbook lists that position as blank. How can you have grace and flexibility with a board, a governing body that does not value those things? Like, you can say heterodoxy and they're going to say heresy. And so if you're asking me what I think the future of the church is institutionally, I'm going to say schism. And I know that's a scary word, but it is a historical reality. Adventists think of themselves as unique. Adventists are a 19th century Methodist derived American religious movement with lifestyle differentiation and apocalyptic leanings. And we've basically seen historically that when you get to like these big impasses, and for the Adventist Church, I think the two major impasses are around women's ordination and gay marriage. It gets a little complicated because there are some people who are pro women's ordination and anti gay inclusion, but often that's like where those things fall, which are questions basically about what it means to be a person, right? It's about gender and sexuality. Historically, we've seen schisms. The Lutheran Church schismed into the Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Wisconsin Synod, and the Missouri Synod, which are divided on questions of biblical inspiration, women's ordination, and gay ordination. The Methodist Church, I can't remember right now off the top of my head if it's schisming or just went through a schism over gay marriage. Like, I don't know how you can have a organization this large that shares money and shares values and fundamentally disagrees on this, because it's basically two different ideas of what it means to be an Adventist at that point. I do think where there is flexibility and where there's room for grace and growth is on the individual church level. Because I think when we look at all these institutions, like if we are asking, what does it mean to be an Adventist? I think the best version of that is to be someone who believes that God will not burn you in hell, who believes that your grandma's soul is not sitting in heaven watching you be bad and like waiting, that believes that we are called to be stewards of the environment and our bodies, that believes that we should not raise a weapon against a fellow human being because we were all created in the image of God. If you believe those things, and you are able to find a church, and I don't mean a church with a capital C, I mean a church like a home or a building or a lobby where you can gather with other people and you can worship and you can take communion and you can wash each other's feet and you can eat potluck. Because let's be honest, I think for a lot of Adventists, myself included, one of my favorite parts was always potluck. And I still do desperately love potlucks. I think that is where you're going to see a model of what a flexible, grace-filled, and heterogeneous Adventism is going to look like. But I don't think it's possible on an institutional level. And I know that's not a very optimistic kind of note, but I don't know. We've seen again and again that even when like the North American division tries to make policies or whatever, that the General Conference stamps down on them, right? Because any kind of structure that's built on hierarchy ends up being built on power, and people don't like sharing power. But at the ground level, where the work of the church actually happens, I think that's where you can see the space for community and for grace.
And I like the way you phrase that too, if we're a top-up church or a top-down, because like you said, that the direction of power, authority, that age-old question, who gets to decide what it means to be a group, right? And then the difference between being in a high building or opposed to being on the ground with the people, with doing the work in community, and how much can we be flexible in that? Like, part of the dynamic is in Canada we get a lot of American-based policies to run schools and things, and we're like, well, that legally sometimes doesn't work and culturally doesn't work. And so that's also part of the dynamic, is where does grace and flexibility come from to even, if we want to baseline it about converting everybody, like where does flexibility come just to be able to convert people well in their cultures, opposed to maintaining, like you said, this 19th century-esque church in the year 2024, 2025? It's like, well, actually, there might be something that we have to grow into, understand. But then that reaction to fear that if we ordain women, it's a slippery slope. Like, well, actually, it's not. Like that slippery slope argument is so often used, or acknowledging that sexuality is expressed in many ways. Like, yeah, it's interesting. You bring up a lot of thoughts and questions that, unfortunately, we won't have hours upon hours in our conversation to dive into, but that are worth exploring in a gracious way. Because I think there's a lot of fear. I've noticed a lot of fear around these questions, a lot of uptightness, and my experience has been identity formed or seeing identity formed in what I know. And so if I come along, or you come along and say, actually, you can know this slightly different, that's a threat. So I think your call to being rooted in the community of that you're known, that you can wash feet, is an excellent call. And what's at stake is community, not the hierarchies of power, right? Like, and I love how you phrase that too, right? Those who want power aren't going to share it. Hierarchy is built upon power. And it seems like we're seeing more and more of that, unfortunately, in higher levels of Adventist leadership, for sure. I want to thank you for your time today, for bringing us some amazing thoughts and conversation. I know I'll walk away thinking a lot more about this and wondering how I've let grace come into my life and the inflexible ways I might approach people. And I know, like we said, it's grounded in the personal interactions at the end of the day. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for listening. If you're interested in more of my work, I'm sure we can put in the show notes my email address. If anyone wants to read any of my academic work, I'd be happy to send it to you via email. That's the great secret of academic publishing, is that journals are paywalled, but the academics will just give you the articles for free.
Yes, I will.
So yeah, and then I write for Spectrum from time to time, so you can find me there. And I also have a weekly Substack newsletter named Syllabus, which we can put in the show notes, where I deep dive on all kinds of things, not just about the church, everything from dandelions to women writers in history, to the concept of gratitude, to the satanic panic of the 1980s. So I'd invite you to check that out if you are at all interested in what I've been talking about today. But thank you so much, Kevin, for chatting and for having me on the podcast.
Thanks for listening. Here are some acknowledgments that make this podcast possible. First of all, these conversations are hosted on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Okanagan people. Also, a big thanks to our Spectrum producer, Alexander Carpenter, along with Bryce Hadlock, our editor, Jared Wright, our graphic designer, and Jared Jameson, our audio producer. Conversations like these cannot happen without the continued support of donors like you. So thank you so much for giving to Spectrum and making this possible. Until our next conversation, have a good one, bud.